This is Angelo John Lewis for the Sacred Inclusion Network podcast. In case you're not familiar with us, the Sacred Inclusion Network is an emerging community of people who honor the sacred in all of its form, practice the integration of diversity and spirituality, and are change makers dedicated to the stewardship of the earth. If you'd like to know more about us, please visit our website, sacredinclusion.com. Today, it's my enormous privilege to interview Robert Bob Dunham, who has worked since 1981 as an executive consultant, educator, and coach to executives, management teams, and coaches worldwide in leadership, communication, teamwork, and what he calls people process redesign. Bob is the founder of the Institute for Generative Leadership. He's got quite an extensive resume, and I'm going to just pick out the highlights, and if there's something he wants to add, he will. Bob is a co-author of the recently published book, The Innovator's Way, Essential Practices for Successful Innovation, with Dr. Peter Dunham. He holds 2 degrees from Stanford University, was on the staff that developed the 3-year ontological design course, and has studied the discipline of embodied learning and leadership extensively. Early in his career, he led the onboard software development team for the Hubble Space Telescope for 3 years. Bob is currently exploring Chinese inner wisdom traditions for their contribution to understanding and embodying generative leadership. Bob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would add that introduction, I haven't heard it in a while. It sounds like quite a technology type guy. And I just want to add to that all of that you just described about me has been part of a journey answering a question: how do human beings create?
Wow. So I know that you're quite a wordsmith, Bob, and you take language very seriously. So I want to start by asking you, since I'm involved in spirituality and all that, what does the word spirituality mean to you?
Well, I had the question. One of the questions of the tradition I come from, Angelo, is to ask the question what before how. Our culture is very much a how-oriented culture. But because we tend to not answer the question what, we wind up answering the how question with the wrong whats. And so this question, what, is very important. And I lived with the question, what is spirit, for most of my life without an answer. And so spirituality, I had a sense of spirituality was easier for me to answer. Spirituality for me, in the traditions that I've come from, is dealing with that which is beyond yourself, beyond everyday senses. And, you can hold that in very many ways. And the word spirit, I remember I met a sister of one of my long-term students and colleagues who was a nun, who'd been, like a nun for 50 years. I said, what is spirit? She said, that's a good question. and so I saw there was no agreed upon answer to the question. But for me, the reason that I lived in the question and didn't have an answer is because I do live in the world of experience. If I answer the question spirit with an answer, but I'm not living it, I can't experience it, it wasn't there yet. But I had the experience about 18 years ago when I was in a very down part of my life, very down. I was in a sense of struggle and I reached the point of despair. And for some reason I said, okay, everything I've done, all my hard work, all my dedication has led me to, it ain't working. And I actually said, I need to go beyond. And what moved me was, I called it the universe. I had a conversation with the universe, literal, real, open-hearted conversation, and said, I'm dedicated to something here, but I can't make it happen. I need help. So I'll do what I can, but it's up to you now. And I literally began to have miracles happening in my life after that conversation. So something beyond me, I can't explain how or what, but I knew that spirit was alive. And so now it's a dimension I think that we have to, uh, each of us has to engage with and find what is it in your life.
I don't know whether this is an appropriate time to ask this or not, but I know that at one point you told me yesterday when we were talking that you were studying something with Dr. Flores.
Yeah.
And you had a whole epiphany, which I think to some extent is related to this question. I wonder if you could share that.
Yeah, absolutely. This was such looking back on it, it was such a simple, profound application.
And give us the context, because people that listening might not know who Dr. Flores is or what you were doing or anything like that.
Okay, Dr. Flores, he's one of my master teachers. He's a pretty widely known philosopher, entrepreneur, writer. He was a senator in Chile. He came from Chile. It's quite a dramatic story. He was put in prison in the Pinochet revolt for 3 years, and took Amnesty International to get him out. Because he was the minister of finance and had been the minister of the interior for Chile. Brilliant man. And he came to the U.S. Not even speaking English, and had to make a life for himself. And he wound up spending a year collaborating with Terry Winograd, who's one of the famous early thinkers in artificial intelligence, and with Bert Dreyfus, a Heideggerian philosopher in Berkeley, and took a lot of courses, and wound up synthesizing the foundation of what I've been working from ever since. His question is, how do human beings take action? So he invented this workshop. And I didn't know any of this about Fernando. I didn't learn that after the workshop, but in the workshop, it was a workshop called Communication for Action. And I had just been promoted to being a program manager in Silicon Valley, in charge of 250 software engineers, 22 managers, and 35 products, and had never done that before. And so I was looking around saying, I need help here. I interviewed people with MBAs and said, will the MBA help me do this job? They said, no. I interviewed all the executives of the company, said, what do I need to learn to do this job? And the answer I got was, good luck. But this situation had arisen because the company was in trouble. It was in a death spiral. It was one of these Silicon Valley overnight successes that couldn't put out a second success. And in Silicon Valley and technology, you have to be a serial creator. You can't do just one. And so it was struggling in that second. And it was so bad that the turnover rate that year was 40%.
Wow.
And I was thinking about leaving the company. But I'd also reached a personal point in my life where I was beginning to find my voice. And I was saying, why aren't we working on excellence here? Why are we so bound up in our problems and friction? And because I had been a speaker of that possibility, they brought in a new VP of development. And he invited me to stay and help him do a turnaround. I didn't know what the hell I was getting into, but I said yes. And he made me program manager. Before that, I'd been a programmer.
Oh.
Big challenge. And so one of the things clearly the mood in the company was bad and surrounded by our problems. The company hadn't been able to get a new product out the door for 2.5 years. So that's the background of me walking into my challenge. And people would say things like, we don't communicate around here. That's one of the reasons I'm leaving. So I heard
that before.
Yeah, exactly. And so I saw this workshop, Communication for Action. I said, I think that'll help. We certainly aren't taking the right action, and we're certainly not communicating. So this is where I met what I now call the tradition that I work from. And in this workshop, they brought the what question. And they said, what is action? And my first reaction was a little bit of shock, saying, I'm not sure I can pass this quiz. I didn't study the chapter last night. And then I calmed down, said, okay, I'm a smart guy and I've done a lot in my career and I can come up with a good answer. And that was my awakening. That was my awakening to what we now call a blind spot. That I'd been living as though myself and everyone else around me knew what action was. And when you asked the question, I really didn't know how to answer that. I mean, you could say movement, activities, but I knew something was missing there. And so they proceeded to offer a new perspective. And they said, action is commitment. And it's such a powerful action that it shapes all the other versions of action that we think we know about, activity and movement and doing, but it arises from commitment. That was like a slap in the face, because here I was a fairly well-educated guy, had a couple of degrees from university, and so the first reaction was, what does this mean? But I knew they were talking to me because I had this big breakdown in the organization I was dealing with. And they proceeded to show that if you're not committed to an action, you're not going to do it. And that there's a quality to that commitment. And so the breakthrough there from the cultural common sense was I began to see something extraordinary, that the internal states of people determine their external behavior and results. And that had not been part of any of my education. And so I learned to do things like make a clear request, make an agreement as commitments, and listen for the commitment, not just the words. And it transformed everything. I wound up having new conversations when I went back to work. And from that perspective, from doing those conversations, looking for producing commitments in people's bodies. So you read it from their body, right? It's not in the word, it's in the person. And I learned to deal with negotiation and saying yes and no. And I began to see that the reason the company had been in trouble was everybody said yes to everything. Nobody felt they could be honest. And so I came in and said, no, I only want an honest commitment here. You can tell me no. And I wound up building honest commitments. And in 6 months, we produced a turnaround. We had all 35 products go out the door, 10 times higher quality than had ever been achieved before, on time, on budget, because we had these new conversations happening. That's why I'm here. That was the experience that I was given a perspective that illuminated the world of action in a new way, but it also illuminated the world of our interior and how they're connected.
I know from talking to you that, and I've heard you speak, and what's enormously attractive to me, in you're a authority on leadership, I'll call you, but your approach to leadership is a little bit different than what I hear when I look at management books.
Yeah.
You're not talking about the external aspect of how do you bark and tell people what to do effectively. Which is it's a crude way of kind of defining the conventional view of leadership and leadership training.
Yeah.
But your generative approach seems to stress the internal aspects of leadership. So I'm going to quote you here. You write, for example, that rather than assume that our internal experiences, moods, and emotions are disconnected from our actions, we see that our moods and actions are fundamental to shaping our actions and our possibilities for actions and outcomes. So, broad question, leadership expert, what is your view of the inner work that is necessary for a prospective or actual leadership leader?
Well, we come back to that, our old friend, what again? What is leadership? And when you ask a question like, what is leadership? You could have 10,000 answers. In fact, if you go to the bookstore, you'll see all the books on the shelf with different answers. So the first thing I want to clarify is I'm looking for a particular kind of answer. And the kind of answer we want to what is something in the domain of action is action. So this translates us to what is leadership as actions that people do. And they have to be actions that you can physically see, do, and that you can improve through learning that actually produce the desired result. That's a very powerful criteria for the kind of answer. And so as I mentioned before, when I was given this perspective that the internal state drives the external action, and that happens through conversation, guess what? Every one of these things is physically observable, experienceable, and it's generative. And so what is leadership? Leadership is interacting with people in a way that their state of commitment shifts, that will modify how they see their world and what actions they will take to what standards. This is done through conversation so that there is a shared agreement and that it is done to a standard that it's trustworthy. So we're not just doing transaction. Will you do this? Yes. No, can you really do this? Are we really on the same page? And so the entire world of communication now becomes the world of action creation. And if you're saying, and as I learned to do, that people are going to produce the results together, if we're on the same page for the outcome, that we've committed to actions, that we can trust those actions. So for example, if you're not competent, don't say yes. I had to coach people to do that because they thought, because I was the boss, that they had to say yes to me. Say, I don't want your yes. I want your promise. I want your commitment, and I want it to be trustworthy. So let's look and see how we can create that. What can you really do here? And so when you go to the internal world, you find there's an anatomy, there's an environment that our mainstream culture is pretty much blind to. What do you find internally? You find emotions. You find moods. And part of the blind spot of our culture is we've separated. Moods used to be, well, that's that personal stuff. You just like ignore it and get to work. No. Your mood and your emotions shape how you see things and what you're going to do. A person who's resigned lives in a story. I can't. It's a fundamental leadership challenge for yourself and others. Well, how can we shift that story to I can? Not in a fantasy way, but in a real way. And then we find the body and body reactions. We find fear. We find contraction. We find the boundary of meeting the other. We find a whole world of interaction. Are we connected? Are we present? Are we open? And so this journey of mine took us to all these domains of moods and emotions, not as descriptions, but as choices. And one of the huge breakdowns of our common sense is people think moods and emotions happen to them and they don't have a choice. No, you when you understand what a mood and emotion is, you can actually begin to design it. That doesn't mean that you suppress it. A lot of people just think you slap a happy face on top of things. No, you actually go in and say, what's driving this mood or emotion? How do I take care of that? And the mood and emotion will shift. Body reaction.
So let me try to help me break this down. So let's say somebody comes to your Institute for Generative Leadership, and her thing is she wants to be a leader.
Yes.
She's always called to be a leader. And you know that in order to take that stance, she needs to do some work on herself.
Yes.
So you talked a little bit about, I heard you talking about body. I heard you talking about emotions. What does that sort of curriculum look like?
Yeah. Well, what we've learned, my colleagues and I have been at this for 40 years now. What we've learned is there's a foundation layer that we want to get to. First of all, we see that our conversations and our perspectives arise in 3 dimensions simultaneously. We call it me, we, and world. And people have problems, particularly obvious in leadership, when we've left one of the dimensions out. So for example, the leaders that are just pounding on the numbers are in the world conversation. But you can't get the numbers to happen. They are a side effect of teamwork in the we space. But you can't just make that procedural. To actually participate effectively in the we space is a full body contact sport. And you have to build the awareness, the body, the moves, the skill in the me space as a leader or as a professional. And so what we find is most people, because it's the dominant narratives of our culture, are in the do, world, get to work. And it's done in a context of seeing action as a mechanical. You are a unit of production, so get to work. And we treat ourselves very badly. But when we shift from the mechanical view to the human view, which has to be a biological view, it has to be a linguistic view, it has to be an emotional view, and it has to be a spiritual view. If we begin to go in there, these show up in that me space. So what do we do there? The relevance of your leadership, the relevance of your action, the relevance in any action arises from your care. Do you care? You see, if you care about something, you take care of it. And so all of a sudden, we see another place where the internal state of your care arises in shaping the actions you take in the external world. And in English, we have a phrase called taking care that says it very well. It's a quality of action. And so when we see bad leadership or organizations in suffering, it's because they're disconnected from their care, because everything's mechanical. And so what does the leader do? We begin the journey with a what question, with this foundation of care. You see, value, satisfaction, and meaning arise from care. This is something that is a blind spot in our culture. If you say, hey, there's this really valuable outcome, come take a look, and you look at it and say, I don't care about it, it's not valuable to you. Or if someone suggests, well, this outcome happened, you must really be satisfied. But if you don't care about it, it's not satisfying. Or you're saying, I'm involved with some activity that my history has told me should be very meaningful, but I don't care about it. It's not meaningful. And so we begin to see the unavoidable link of your internal relationships with your body, your with life itself. And this all happens in stories as well. And so where do we start? We ask, what do you care about? And then we ask the second question, because caring's not enough. We ask, are you taking care of what you care about? Now, for those who are listening, I want to say that because people in our culture have not been educated to the power of the question, what do you care about? Most people don't have a clear answer. It's perplexing. It's like, damn, and we go to, well, I care about my family. Okay, how's that going to inform your value, satisfaction, and meaning in the domain of your work life or your action life, or different domains? People take 6, 12, 24 months in this practice to discover and refine and find their choice, and also uh, in their answer to what they care about. And also, there's a place where they have to shed ego. There's a place where this is not a choice in the sense of, well, I want to be rich and famous, so I'll say I care about that. No, there's a part of you, a deep part of us, many traditions would call it your soul, that has one concern. That concern is, are you alive? Are you really living? And it's constantly whispering to us, but it's outshouted by our opinions and our reactions and our problems, and so we have to go, and that's where we meet spirit. That's where we often begin to have that initial conversation of what's beyond my historical opinions or desires or preferences. And in Chinese medicine, for example, this is referred to as destiny. Your destiny is not a fate. It's not that you're going to turn out a particular way. Your destiny is simply that you are something, and your destiny is to be that something. Now, you can either align with that or you can fight it. So if you're an oak tree, then your destiny is to be a good oak tree, and trying to be a panther doesn't work out so good. And so people got to kind of get like, am I an eagle? Am I a dolphin? Am I a rose? And that's part of the message of spirit, I think, is find deeply who you are in the universe. And when people go there, we're always working with these questions also with, at the same time you're doing this internal exploration, we work with people in the context of you're a leader, which means you're working with other people to create a shared future. And that happens in conversation. What are the conversations you're having? How are you learning to have the right conversations to take care of what you care about and to share that with others? That's the world of leadership. And what do you need to do to learn how to do that? Well, the first thing you need to do is learn how to meet others, because our entire education system tends to teach people to be solo artists. We're really terrible at working together. And so we like, are you producing shared care? Are you producing shared commitment? Are you producing shared practices? Are you producing shared standards? That's the job of the leader. That enables coordination. And that shared care gives you, well, we're doing this because it matters. That's a missing conversation. In our programs, in the first few months, we have people talk to their teams and say, well, what do we care about together? This isn't just mechanical process here. We're living our lives here. We're creating the future together here. What do we care about? And in that journey of having these new conversations, you find the limits of your history, the places where you stop, the places where you're afraid, the places where you sure as hell don't want to go there. And we call that working with the edge. Everybody has edges. The edge is where you feel you go from knowing to not knowing, from being confident to being uncertain, to often encountering fear. But the possibilities beyond what you have now are always on the other side of the edge. So what do we have to learn? We have to learn to notice that as embodied linguistic emotional beings, that we have a lot going on. What's the story that arises? Does that story support you or not? What's the emotion that arises? Emotions we found come in two flavors. They either open possibilities or close them. And do you hang out in the emotions that close your possibilities, like resignation, resentment, fear, contraction, anxiety, overwhelm? The list goes on and on. And so you have to learn to face these emotional states and enter them for the sake of transforming them. Not in a shallow way, but in a real way, because every emotion is connected to a story. I'm afraid because, I'm anxious because, I'm avoiding because. And then that's where the leader faces, well, you need a different story of the relationship you're going to have with the because. In fact, one of the fundamental relationship transformations in the world of emotions is with fear. Fear is a feeling that's very visceral. It's very, life and death aspect to it. It's there to help us survive. But a lot of the fears that people have come from a very young age. And then it has become a barrier that because they avoided something at that barrier, fears became a habit. And so we need fear to go from deciding for us to becoming an advisor. That we have a conversation with the fear, because I learned very early in this journey, I could be afraid and move out of my commitment anyway. So that one of the learnings in the somatic emotional domain is we have fear reactions, we don't become them. And this is where we actually begin to discover what we call being generative is. Being generative is having choices to grow yourself through practice in this somatic, body, emotional, linguistic soup that we live in, to design it, to shape it, to become who we are. And in saying that, I have to be very careful, because the mechanical point of view of our culture is, okay, Bob's given us the push, we'll just turn ourselves into blah, blah, blah. And he said, no, it's a dance. The universe is always insisting on the reality it brings. You are 50% of every experience, never the 100%. We're always in dialectic with life.
There are so many different threads I want to untangle here, but I want to ask you this one question. It kind of relates to caring, in a sense. There's so much going on in the world, Bob. Climate change. Lately, there's income income inequality, racial unrest.
Yes.
At the same time, there is these organizations. And organizations, at the end of the day, they have to create widgets. They have to have some product that has to come out, or service that has to come out. So if I'm a leader and I've been hired to make better widgets, let's say, or to produce a better service for my customers, that's my main job. What do I do with all this stuff that is floating around in the society? How do I integrate those two things?
Yeah. Good question. I've certainly lived through that question myself. The perspective that I think empowers us from this generative perspective of generative conversation is to see, first of all, that human life, everything's happening in conversation, everything's producing certain commitments, and then that drives what we're doing. So when you say I'm going to produce widgets or service, we transform that to promises to produce value for others that you care about. And so all of a sudden, you're not sacrificing your living meaningful choices in life because I got widgets at the other end. No, they're promises I care about. If I'm going to bake cakes, I want them to be cakes that delight people. That's meaningful. It's valuable. So we we begin to transform the work itself that way. When you see these big these big issues, the perspective we bring is those are conversations too. Climate change is not something just happening out in the world. It's a conversation. And it's a conversation in which commitments are being made that affect that external. Here we are again, the internal, the external. And then because we're facing these world level issues, we can contract. We can get lost in the story, I'm too small. And but if everything's a conversation, you do have a voice. You can engage. And when you begin to bring a new conversation, we're bringing it for the sake of taking care of something, then you can enroll people into this conversation or find people who are already in the conversation. And this is the way it is always. And so when we see the big issues like climate change, for example, I see that as a conflict of an old set of stories of what the world is and what it should be and what level of convenience I should have in it versus a new set of stories. And people get very uncomfortable with new stories.
All right. So let's say I work for General Motors. I'm just picking that name out of a hat. And all of a sudden I'm hearing the conversations going on around me, which are not necessarily at work, but they're everywhere. Let's just take climate change as one.
Yes.
At some point, it almost becomes, if I'm caring, I've got to do something about that. At the same time, I still got to take care of General Motors.
Sure.
I still got my managerial responsibilities, let's say. What might it look like? What sort of conversation might I have that would kind of bring those two worlds together?
Yeah, I'll give you three layers. One is I'm as an individual, I go out and find organizations that are taking positive action with climate change, and I support them in some way. Maybe I get involved with them. Maybe I contribute. That's no conflict with my job. Second is I see, given I have a voice, is there anything I can contribute in some group? Could I be a local leader for certain things to happen? For example, clean up the beach or something, or simply how do we teach kids about this, or how do we teach our community about it? And then in General Motors and widgets, they live in the world too, right? If climate change is a real issue that's affecting, it's affecting them too. And so what is the conversation in my job, in my company, that this integrates into the set of concerns that the company's dealing with? And I found when I was working in Silicon Valley, for example, I could have conversations about these things with other people at work. I could do it at lunch. I could bring it up in a staff meeting. I could say, who's already thinking about this? I could still be a voice about the concern. And this brings us to kind of the end point of leadership, or the transition point of leadership, is we go internal to care, we touch spirit, we say, what do we want to take care of? We come out, we learn to have a voice, we learn to face all the breakdowns, because this doesn't make everything easier. It just makes you able to cope with all the breakdowns are coming. Mm-hmm. See, leadership isn't that I'm finally in charge, and so leaders get all the crap that no one else wants to deal with, right? And so you grow yourself to have that be your work. I'm going to deal with the resistance. I'm going to deal with the problems, and then the act. If we go back to language, go back to empowerment, the act in this area is, what offer can you make? You see, we are already a walking offer in the world. And that offer is listened to by other people. We are perceived as an offer based on how we walk down the hall, based on what we talk about and how we talk about it. And this is where beginning to look at what are the conversations of my life? What do I care about? What conversations am I having about them? And one of the challenges in this perspective is you see that as a human being, you're finite. You can't take care of everything. You can't have every conversation. You can't be perfect. So you learn, I can't do everything, but I can do something. What's my something? Mm-hmm. And if I'm willing to be committed to a something that is so important to me, so deep in my care that it's worth dedicating a life to, then life is giving me the chance to practice and improve and expand my voice and my impact every day. I don't need to be the world changer today. Yeah, we'll be later. But what is the meaning of the journey? Take care, take care, take care, and learn. Well, I mean, what else are you going to do with your life? And then it becomes part of everything. And so this separation that, my job is not a place. Yes, it is. Because everything's conversation. And by being in the question, we begin to see what's possible.
Bob, you've given us a flavor of the power of what you call generative conversation, and it's just a flavor. It's tremendously deep, in my opinion. So, as I stated earlier, there's a lot of different things going on in our society right now.
Yes.
So there's generative conversation we need to have at work, and I know I'm separating the two, world and work, but humor me for a moment. I'm just wondering, what's your sense of, first of all, say a little bit more about what you mean by generative conversation. So just that's my first part. And the second is that what sort of generative conversations do we need to have as a society to address the challenges in today's world? I know it's a big question, but first, what is generative conversation, and how does it look like to your
very good.
Your thank you. I'm getting better.
Yeah.
And how might we engage in those conversations to address these world-changing challenges?
Well, generative conversation is a conversation that produces a commitment or a shift in commitment. See, you and I can talk about climate change, blah 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 every day. We can go for you, like we can chatter about, but nothing never happens. No commitment is made. No new action arises. And so when there's conversation that's just talking but doesn't produce commitment, we call those descriptive conversations. Mm-hmm. And people they're very entertaining. Gossip and expressing an opinion. It's like, but when we begin to bring the observer of the domain of action is, what the hell are we going to do with this concern? That's a generative conversation. And it turns out that there's a very rigorous and powerful structure of generative conversations, that commitments are generated with specific acts in language. So if I request you to do something, what have I just done? It could be as simple as, pass the salt. It could be as big as, hey, come on over. I want to talk to you about launching a new company. And what have I done with that request? I have generated a new future. I have generated a choice that didn't exist for you. And this is part of this world of leadership, is I can begin to generate choices for people. Mm-hmm. I can do the same thing with offers. Hey, I have this new approach. I have this new conversation. I have this new thing that is possible in the world of whatever concern we're talking about, climate change or whatever. And I offer a conversation with you. I've just changed the future. I've created a choice that didn't exist before I spoke. That's generative. When we go to the world of action in organizations, for example, this is unavoidable. If leaders are going to coordinate a team to produce excellent teamwork. Excellent teamwork comes from agreements about who's going to do what for whom, when, and to what standard. Those are conversations. And those are generative. And when you go to an organization and people walk out of a meeting bored and saying that was a waste of time because no commitments were made, nothing changed, no future action or outcome was created. That became very clear to me in my Silicon Valley startup story. That part of why my company was in a malaise, a death spiral, they weren't having generative conversations. And we began to have them. Well, what are we going to do about it? Here's my request. What's your promise? Are we going to deliver? Can we trust it? And it just kind of unfolded. And so we're already in generative conversations. Where you produce action in your life, you're already having generative conversation. Where you feel stuck, where nothing's happening, or there's resignation or some other mood floating around, we haven't transformed that into a generative conversation with a request or an offer or a claim. And so this is part of the amazing power we found of this generative tradition and approach, is that we're not talking in abstractions. We're talking about in concrete acts that you can do with skill. And so the small summary of the acts and language that shift the future, there's 6 speech acts: requests, offers, promises, assessments. I think we should do this. I don't think we should do this. Assertions, this is true, this is not true. And declarations, I'm going to do this. I'm going to stand for this. Those are all acts that change the future. And they're available to us. We're already doing them, and people are blind to it, so they don't do it very well. And then when they get into a situation like my company in Silicon Valley, where things are not going well, because we're blind to the generative conversations and don't know how to have them, we don't dig ourselves out. So that's generative conversation. And once you see that you have this palette to paint with, now you can begin to paint a new future. You can begin to have new conversations. So if we see these conversations in taking care of these big issues in society, this last 20 years of seeing what's unfolded in politics, for example, here in the U.S., the big back and forth around race that's going on, the big back and forth around, you can get a sense of, there's an agenda. They're going to make up whatever story it is that fits their agenda. Like some people are anti-government now, and other people see government as a place to solve problems. And so there's a big argument about that. And they're generative. And so there's a big argument, and but what has happened emotionally over the last several decades is we're not listening anymore. We're only talking without listening. And this has been cultivated. You can go to the sources of any position and begin to see where that happens. So I would say with these issues in society, one is you can take a stand for what you want to see happen, see how you can link with others. You go from me to we, so that we can make a difference in the world. But what you're going to find is the people who are have a counter view. You're going to find resistance. And I view that the world and its suffering and challenges right now are based on 2 things that we haven't learned to address yet. We're not having conversations to create a shared future. This fragmentation and demonization has taken, and so I don't have an easy solution to it, but uh, we are creating the shared future, and it's getting pretty sucky.
Yeah.
And so there's some missing. There's something missing, and this is a point of study for me. The second thing I think that is at the root of a lot of what's going on that I consider breakdowns in the world is we're not asking the deep enough question.
Mm.
The deep question that we're avoiding is, what kind of human beings are we going to be?
Mm.
Because when you answer that question, then you can begin to say, what kind of world are we going to create? And we get stuck in old traditional, well, business and blah blah blah, and so I see that our blindness about discourse and conversation is uh, is a description of why some of the dynamics are going on. And if I go back to the political issue in the U.S., it's all driven by emotions, not by logic. There's no logic here. Every time the logic seems to get a counter arguments, like there's an emotional. We're not dealing with the source of the emotional issues, and this can get really, really bad. The emotion that some people have learned to cultivate that leads to destruction. I believe that life gives us a choice of you either cultivate and create or you destroy. And there's a lot of commitment seeming to build for destructive discourses that I'm so pissed off and I'm so blaming other people, I'm willing to destroy. And this can turn into rage. Rage, from this point of view, rage and the conversations that cultivate it are a great explanation of what Hitler did and what Stalin did and what Mao Zedong did and what Trump has been trying to do. And destruction is not going to create a great world. How do we live together and cultivate and create together is the only viable option. I see that is the conversation I'm interested in, and I don't have the magic wand of how to make it work, but at least it's opening some points of focus.
Yeah, that's helpful and that's honest. And to some extent, you might say that all we can do is be involved in this generative conversation that produces actions, et cetera, et cetera. That's a kind of a small way of perhaps addressing it.
Yes.
But we have finite time, so I did want to ask you a sort of a personal question, and I have a little script, I'm going to read it.
Okay.
In the promotional video of your course, the course is The Power of Ancient Wisdom. You talk about the Institute's mission is to not only help people better create together the results they want to see in the world, but the experience of having a valuable and an internal, meaningful life. I wonder, Bob, if you could share a bit about the generative conversations you've had with yourself or with others that have helped you craft a meaningful internal life.
Beautiful. We refer to that as a good life. And when I started talking about the good life, what I realized that I hadn't heard that word being used much since I was a boy. It's kind of been missing in our culture, that there is a good, meaningful life rather than simply, get your degree, get a job, buy stuff and die. No, we have a chance to have a good life, but a good life is not a selfish life. It's not just about pleasure or wealth or power. A good life is you're fully alive. You're manifesting your destiny. I think the most powerful clarification for that for me has been find what you care about and dedicate yourself to taking care of it. Then you have value, satisfaction, and meaning, and that's a good life. It doesn't have a requirement on income. That may be a domain of concern that we all take care of, but that's the focus that people are struggling with when they follow the cultural success stories of, do this and do that and get rich and famous. So given that that's possible, then why aren't we doing it? What are all the distractions? What are all the ways that we get off track? And one of the biggest symptoms of that is overcommitment. Dealing with people that work but don't have much of a life outside of it. People who say, "Yeah, I want to be home for dinner with the kids every night," but I said, just don't seem to make it. You know, my job's so hard. They're so demanding. And this is where we begin to see our choices of the kind of life we can have. I believe that creating a good life for yourself and others will produce a more valuable and sustainable path of evolving uh, uh, cultivation and growth of value, satisfaction, and meaning in our lives. And it doesn't mean we won't have breakdowns. Doesn't mean we won't have pain. It just gives us a context to hold it all in.
So, I mean, I would obviously be remiss if you're listening to this in the next couple of weeks, which is like, what is this? This is July 8th. Bob is going to be leading our Sacred Inclusion Network in an exploration. I've got to figure out a title today, but it's going to be something about spirituality and leadership. And if you want to know more about it, go to our website, sacredinclusion.com, and I'll tell you about it. Bob, this is just like, I hope this is an appetizer for folks, because I personally feel you have a lot to share that's valuable. It's been valuable for me listening to you, and I think it'd be valuable for anyone who wants to engage with a lot of your ideas and a lot of your actions. But I do want to pause a moment before I give you a formal goodbye and tell people a little bit about the Sacred Inclusion Network. Not a lot, but just a little bit. I talked about our mission. You can look on our website. The simplest way to get figure out what we're doing is to join our private Facebook group. We have an online community meeting, which Bob is going to host the third Saturday of every month generally. You can find out about the host and our regular gatherings by going to our website and looking for events. Another way, if you want to support us, you can support our podcast on Patreon for as little but as $1 a day. You can get sort of in touch with the inner circle, I should say. Bob, it's just been an enormous pleasure and a privilege to get to know you a little bit and to know about your work and to learn from you. So thank you so much for being my guest.
And let me say it's been an honor to meet you and to learn about the network. Thank you.
Yeah.